Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. And thanks to so many of you for coming along. Um, Hopefully you can hear me okay. I'm operating through my headphone mic, so glad that's working okay. Um, as you heard from Sarah's very lovely introduction, my background is um, primarily in environmental science or conservation science, conservation biology. So some of the examples I'll give will have an environment lens to them, but over the past 15 years or so, I've been working with evidence synthesis across different disciplines from health and public health to international development, um, climate, um, climate science, um, a sort of broad range of different areas. And so, as part of that, I think I've helped out with around 250 systematic review projects. Um, and I think my favorite part of that mentoring and helping and being a co-author and leading projects is in the question formulation, partly because it's a really valuable point to get it right before you move on and avoid expensive mistakes, but partly because there is always a right methodology to fit the question that you're asking. Um, and so, sort of picking your methods and adapting your methods to answer the question is a really satisfying component of planning a systematic review for me. So that's what I'm going to be sharing with you over the next half an hour or so is my experience of developing questions that are systematically reviewable and managing the um, the balance, the trade-off between wanting to do a topic that is as of greatest interest as possible, whilst also making sure that you've pragmatically got something that's feasible with the resources that you have at your disposal. Um, and part of my experience over the last 15 years has been working with often early career researchers or people doing evidence synthesis in resource constrained environments. So a lot of that has been trying to deal with evidence bases that have a tendency to bloat a bit because of interest, but also on the flip side that we are going through this sort of very steep increase of publication of research articles. So the projects that I think of now that I was leading back in 2012, 2011 would be unfeasible now because of the volume of literature. So that massaging of your question to be something that is feasible with the time and resources you have available at the moment still requires some pragmatism. And so that's what I'm going to sort of run through my experience and some tips that I've found really useful, and some frameworks and definitions that help to be in a position of being able to do this in an educated way. So start off by explaining, first of all, what question framing is in the context of a systematic review and why it's important. Um, we'll then talk a little bit about system boundaries as a lens and a framework for understanding systematic review questions. We'll talk about what types of questions that are systematically reviewable. And when I say systematically reviewable, I'm broadly speaking about evidence synthesis that involves both systematic reviews and evidence maps and systematic maps, at least in the context of this presentation. We'll then have a bit of time going through some tips and practices that I use to formulate questions that can be easily reviewed, and talk about the implications of that framing practice on the amount of workload and the volumes of searches that you end up with, before talking about some case studies that I've been involved with that sort of show the diversity of projects, why the project started, what its objectives were, the way that the question ended up being framed, and what product we ended up with. And that I think will just highlight some of the differences that I'll talk through from a theory perspective. And then I'll sort of introduce this practice that many people will be familiar with, finally talking about iterative reframing. So thinking about reframing your question to manage the number of search results so that it's both sensible from a perspective of stakeholders being happy with the scope and everybody having a question that they understand sensibly, but also making sure that it's something that's feasible within the time frame that you have. So often when we start off thinking about the question for an evidence synthesis project, we start off with either someone who's commissioned us to do the work or us as a team thinking, I'm interested in something. First of all, this isn't a question and therefore can't be answered, but it is inherently where we all come from in research. We have an interest in something, we want to understand how it works. And it might be, for example, I'm interested in the best way to treat prostate cancer. This is starting to sort of approach a question, but isn't systematically reviewable. And the reason is that we don't know for whom, we don't know under what conditions, we don't know how they're talking about measuring whether treatment works or not. And there are specifics in this way that the issue is framed at the moment mean that we do not know if we're using shared definitions, the same definition for what that treatment type might be. So there's everything from a broad up to a very pedantic level of detail that's missing from that way of formulating a problem. So the whole process of question framing is to go through a process of defining all of the concepts that we're using, being very specific, and then making sure that the questions that are evolving map onto the relevance that's needed in terms of the people who asked us to do the review or who our end users are, if it's something that we've initiated, and who is going to be using the outputs of the review, making sure that it's of relevance to them, but also pragmatically that it matches the available budget and time that we have. So often people are interested in, people who are interested in what the literature says start off with broad concerns. So they might ask, what is the best intervention for a given outcome? What happens when this phenomenon takes place? Or how can we best treat a particular problem? And these are not closed questions. They're not answerable with systematic review yet. Although they're highly applied, for many people, particularly people in policy, they might already think, in our experience, they come along with a question that looks like that, and they think it's already very specific because it's at the level of a broad policy issue, which for them may be very specific. But they're still not, they're not questions that we can answer. Some of the issues with these are that they might be too big a topic, which means that our project might not work because they're too big. It might be that the people intentionally have this desire to see what we get in terms of the review, and then understand the system as they go. And although there are some methods that allow that sort of practice, a single review doesn't allow you to answer a question like that. You need to have some understanding of what you're looking for before you start. If you don't, your criteria for inclusion and involvement in the review will change over time, and you'll suffer from something called mission creep. Another issue is that you may have different definitions for your main concept in your question, and that you then go away and answer a question that they didn't ask, that they understood in a slightly different way. So that's really important to make sure that you're on the same sheet there. And it might be that there are poorly defined concepts that to everybody in the room they agree with, but actually when it comes to the practice of defining them statistically, if you're doing a meta-analysis, for example, or comparatively, you are faced with an impossible task. For example, what counts as best? Best in terms of a particular outcome, cost efficiency, acceptability. That lack of definition means that you similarly might end up asking a different question or combining things together that shouldn't be combined together. Conversely, good questions are ones that are closed and very specifically defined. However, there is a spectrum within closed and defined questions from not very specific to much more specific. So, for example, what's the most effective treatment for problem A is still lacking some detail of for whom, what outcome, how's it measured, how is the effectiveness of treatment A different across populations 1 to 3, what outcomes being measured, what's the type or the intensity of the intervention, which outcomes are affected by phenomenon A in population X, and by how much might sound very specific, but we still don't perhaps have a shared understanding of what the intensity or duration of that phenomenon is, and to what degree that can be encapsulated into the question, what's accepted and how is it dealt with, but also how was the outcome measured? What is the effectiveness of treatment A on outcome X for population 1 is slightly closer to the well-defined end of that spectrum. But the ultimate goal is to ensure that we have a question that's understood equally by everybody, with a stake in the topic, but particularly the review group and the people who are in need of the question being answered. Or at least it should be as broadly accepted in definitions as possible. Sometimes people won't agree on a definition, but having a clear caveat of that difference in definition is important from the start. One additional point is that for many systematic reviews, the way to understand whether you've got a systematically reviewable question is to say, could a primary study answer this question? That is often very helpful because sometimes we can get bogged down in systems level questions that deal with entire conceptual frameworks, but actually the question that we're answering is just one spoke in that theory of change. And so if the primary studies exist, then we would want to perhaps be focusing on aggregating those primary studies. So it helps to sometimes see to what degree a hypothetical primary study exists to answer the question that we've identified for a systematic review. But there's an important caveat to that, in that there is a spectrum between aggregative systematic reviews and configurative systematic reviews. I'll just explain that briefly because it does affect how we search and what methods we use. So many systematic reviews, most traditional systematic reviews, particularly in the field of healthcare intervention effectiveness, seek to combine the results from almost identical studies. So they would be asking, if we treated all of these individual primary studies as one very large study, what would they say collectively about the effectiveness of this treatment or the impact of this exposure? It would be aiming to say, overall, how big is the effect? This is a rather trivialized example of a true aggregative synthesis. We're only interested in what every study says, and those studies should all answer the same question. On the other end, a lot of systematic reviews specifically are interested in difference. This is particularly following the evolution of systematic review methodology from like 2005 onwards, where social science questions started to be asked in systematic reviews using qualitative synthesis methods. People started to realize that systematic reviews were very well positioned to answer questions that looked at whole systems. So they might specifically be asking how much diversity exists in the evidence base, what factors affect effectiveness, not just does it work or not, but how is that effectiveness altered by context, for whom, under what circumstances. This is the name that's given to configurative synthesis. We're interested in the diversity, interested in understanding how systems work. And in a configurative synthesis, your primary studies might ask quite different questions. They might not all be the same intervention in the same way being tested in the same population against the same outcome measured in the same way. It might be that you're particularly interested in different circumstances, different interventions, different types of measurement, to look at the nuance. In practice, most systematic reviews do a bit of both. So a meta-analysis that includes a covariate to see how age affects effectiveness, that is slightly configurative. So although in practice you might be combining studies that all broadly answer the same question. There might still be some diversity there. So many systematic reviews do need primary studies that answer exactly the same question or large flavors of that same question. But some cases you might be combining studies that individually don't map onto your question. So that's just something to have in the back of your mind, that if you're interested in collectively what does the evidence base say, you can create a hypothetical primary study and see how well your question maps onto the studies that you'd be finding. But in some contexts, that might not be an appropriate tool to use for question formulation. So why is it important? Well, scope setting is the foundation of all evidence synthesis. If you get it wrong and you answer a different question, every subsequent methodological stage is based on this question formulation and specification stage. So it's really important to do well at the beginning. It also decides replicably what's in and what's out. So in order for us to be consistent over time and across colleagues and with verification from other people reading the review, we want to be very specific about what's relevant and what's not. It also helps to ensure that definitions are widely accepted and understood as being the same across our stakeholders, to avoid coming back at the end with something that people understand differently. To avoid general misunderstandings in core concepts, this is particularly an issue for anything that's interdisciplinary, where different academic fields may have different understandings of specific terms. I remember one systematic review that I was doing, which involved a qualitative arm and a quantitative arm. We had this really circular argument for a couple of weeks within the team about data extraction because we had fundamental differences in our understanding of the word data. So for the qualitative researchers, everything that you extract that describes a study is data. And for us, we were specifically talking about data being the findings from primary studies. And it was a really enlightening experience, possibly quite obvious to a lot of people, but there was this very easily avoidable misunderstanding for a while. And my definition of data is now sort of broadened out as a result. But those misunderstandings happen all the time. Question formulation is also an important practice to do in combination with trialing our search strategy and building our search strategy to make sure that what we end up with is manageable and we don't try and do a systematic review with 10 million search results, and respond to it by, it may not only be that our search strategy has a problem, it might be that our system boundaries are too broad, as we'll come on to. So this is all essentially about system boundaries. And thinking in terms of system boundaries helps us to define what's in and what's out of this project. It doesn't necessarily mean it's not going to be answerable in the future, but it's about matching the scope of the intended question onto available resources. So what I mean by system boundaries is thinking about who we're including or what we're including if we're not dealing with people. And those systems might be from the local up to the global. The what we're investigating, whether this is an intervention or an exposure, so whether it's something that's being done for a particular outcome or something that's being experienced as a phenomenon. And that could vary from being one fixed intervention that we're interested up to a network of multiple interventions that are used in combination and comparison. Often we would be looking at causality, and so evidence of causality needs to demonstrate an impact relative to a control or a comparator or a business as usual case. And that might be that we would be looking for studies where they test the intervention versus no intervention, or the intervention versus before the intervention was put in place, or it could be multiple different interventions being combined. How much, meaning the outcome. So we could be measuring our outcome, just a particular outcome using fixed units, or we could combine synonymous outcomes that are similar but not identical. They might be measured in a range of different units, so they would be need to be standardized before being combined. Or it could be multiple different outcomes that are completely disparate that we're combining into a more complex analysis. To answer our questions, we could be combining multiple different study types, or we could be fixed on, for example, just modeling studies or experimental or controlled studies, or open to observational and field studies. And within your own discipline, there will be a whole suite of different study types that are sometimes in some disciplines often arranged in a hierarchy. So your strength of evidence might come into deciding where those boundaries lie for you. And then also importantly, what lens are we using to look at this question? So are we looking at the analyses that the authors conducted on the data they extracted, or are we just using authors' own data and looking through those studies at the underlying data? Are we interested in the studies and what those authors looked at, which is more of a mapping question? Or if enough evidence exists, could we have a look at review articles? So the lens there could be that we are looking at articles that have already synthesized evidence. And that will depend very much on the evidence base that you're looking at. I'll come back to this idea of system boundaries in a bit to explain how we use that. But thinking about what types of question are systematically reviewable, we often start to go through a process of defining our questions, and still they are more exploratory. So it might be, what do we know about? Lots of questions start that way. What do we know about how this system works or how well this is? And it's not really answerable as it is because it's not clear if that is a systematic review question or an evidence map, systematic map question. So the key thing here is that if the objective or the aim is to generate knowledge to help guide action, then it needs refining into systematic review questions. And it may be that that ends up being broken down into multiple review questions. If we're more interested in understanding what's been done, where, and how, understanding the nature of the research environment, the evidence base, that's an evidence mapping question. And it may be that we start out with a map to understand the broader evidence and then go on to systematic reviews. But understanding the objective is really key to plotting out your review question. So evidence maps, which I'm broadly including here broadly defining here to include scoping reviews, systematic maps, evidence and gap maps, or evidence gap maps as they're differently defined. They are essentially all asking what research is being conducted and what does it look like. They are asking questions like by whom, when, where, what type of systems being studied, what were the methods, what were the trends in research over time, but they don't ask what did those studies find. And that's because evidence maps are just looking at the state of the evidence base. For the process of extracting study findings and synthesizing them, you would really be wanting to do full critical appraisal with a different critical appraisal tool for each study design before synthesis. And so that's why we don't extract and present study findings in evidence maps. That's the next stage. But if your question is more about the nature of the evidence base, then an evidence mapping question is for you. Full synthesis, on the other hand, is asking what does research collectively say about, for example, the effectiveness of a particular intervention, treatment, or action, the impact of a phenomenon or factor, which factors affect a relationship and how prevalent a particular phenomenon is in a given context, how accurate a particular methodology is and what affects that accuracy, what the lived experiences are for people affected by a phenomenon or action, the acceptability of a particular intervention or treatment. The list goes on. Those are the kinds of formulations that we'd want to be seeing in a systematic review. There are other types of systematic review question which are not quite so common. One that I've worked on a little bit every now and then is establishing or exploring definitions in the academic literature, like how are tipping points defined in the literature? Or it could be that we're using evidence synthesis methods to synthesize other forms of evidence. So I've been involved in a review that was mapping out evidence on what environmental impact assessments predicted would be the impacts of Arctic metal mining. So there is diversity in the types of questions that can be answered, and I find it really interesting when you come across a new type of question and have to adapt the methodology to answer it. But when we're trying to develop those questions, what we can use is something called key elements. And these are basically the core components of our systematic review question, broken down into definable system boundaries, definable system boundaried definitions. So, for example, if we had a very specific question, like what's the effectiveness of enzalutamide for prostate cancer treatment in men over 70 years, we can use this particular mnemonic to break our question down. It's often used in the field of healthcare, which is where the component population comes from, because it's always a human population that's being described. But you'll often see people referring to PICO, or what their PICO elements are. And the P stands for population, the I for intervention, the C for comparator, and the O for outcome. But P could be any population or the target area of the review. It doesn't necessarily need to mean a biological or human population, but in this case it specifically does. So the population here is men over 70. The intervention is all enzalutamide. The comparator is actually not explicit in the question, so we don't say what's the effectiveness of enzalutamide relative to no enzalutamide. That's clunky and not easy to say, so it's implicit that we are comparing a drug with a lack of that drug, and the outcome is disease reduction. As I'll show in a little while, this is still not overly specific. We can define this down even more. But a note on the difference between an intervention and an exposure. An exposure is something that is felt normally unintentionally, whereas an intervention is put in place for a particular outcome. The difference is not particularly important, but in this case, what is the impact of neonicotinoid pesticides on pollinators around arable fields in temperate regions? The population is temperate regions, the exposure is neonicotinoids, the comparator is no nicotinoids, and the outcome is pollinators, which we can already see probably needs to be defined. But that's how we go about breaking our question down to see if we have the available information to populate that kind of framework. And there are loads of these frameworks out there. Andrew Booth wrote a paper a while ago with something like 35 different acronyms, and they are adaptable. There's ones like SPIDER, which is sample phenomenon design, evaluation and research type. SPICE, PO, so if you're looking at prevalence, how prevalent are neonicotinoid pesticides in the environment, for example, then that's just a population and outcome. PO, PIRD. So these are all different ways of breaking down your question. The obvious one is if you don't have a comparator, for example. So if you're doing a more mapping question, or qualitative research, for example, a comparator is always implicit and inherent in qualitative research, or often. So that's why we pick one of these. But the most important thing is that you are breaking your question down and defining it. And if you can't define it and can't be specific, then that's where you need to work through refining your question. And the implications of this framing are obviously going to have knock-on effects on the workload. So although it's vital to match the synthesis that we answer, the question that we answer, to the knowledge need, the broader the topic, and often policymakers and people with knowledge needs do want to go more broad, the more evidence that's going to mean, and the more resources we're going to have at our disposal to answer that question. because ultimately what it means is more screening and more data extraction and critical appraisal. It's also really important to have the resources, to make sure that the resources we have are able to answer that question. So if we feel pushed to do a broad topic and we want to answer that broad topic, we don't want to be a disappointment. We might find that we run out of time part of the way through. And in the next session that I give, I'll give some pragmatic advice and tips on how you can avoid that risk of ending a project without an answer. But it does highlight that it's important to know your topic and to be iteratively going away and getting a feel for what the implications of system boundaries mean to the search results you're getting back. But some promising, I guess, things to bear in mind is that just minor adjustments to system boundaries and the way that we search, adding a new system can significantly affect the number of search results, the scope of the work. So it might not take a huge amount of effort to massage our question into something that's really inherently manageable. So for example, this was the example I gave earlier. And if we were to say, instead of all men over 70, we said British men over 70 with stage 3B cancer, specifically looking at just where oral enzalutamide was provided after initial radiotherapy, and the comparator might only be to include studies where it was a placebo being provided after radiotherapy, and the outcome being measured was specifically PSA levels. That narrows the question down considerably, but might still be a really satisfactory answer to the people who need the knowledge. And yeah, there are a huge number of cases where systematic review has worked really well, where we have terminologically homogeneous topics. So these are where we are looking at the same thing and it's all defined in ways that have synonyms. So the intervention we're interested in, for example, might be described in slightly different terms, but those terms exist and are used in all of the research. So, for example, what's the impact of drug A on outcome, on a specific outcome measured using a particular method and measured in a specific population? For each of those components, we can use a synonym that would exist in the title, the abstract, or the keywords of the records we want to find. The problem in question framing, the ones that I really hate, are reviews where we've got what I call semantically homogeneous topics, or they're referred to as diffuse constructs as well. But we've got a topic that means the same thing, but it's described in different terms in different fields, or the diversity is not really known. And example I have of that is a map we did on buffer strips around arable fields. And they're used for lots of different reasons, but sometimes to reduce wind erosion, sometimes to improve biodiversity. And everybody uses different terms for them. But we weren't really aware of all of the terms that were available. So it was a concept. Buffer strips as a concept was really diverse. Other worse examples are terms like ecosystem services, nature-based solutions, resilience, climate adaptation, planetary boundaries, One Health, sustainable transitions and transformational change. So much research exists on those that does not use those terms. So these topics are really difficult to frame a question around because you don't really know where the system boundaries are, what counts as one of those things and what doesn't. So that's something to be aware of and bear in mind. We might be able to have a targeted specific search for terminologically homogeneous topics pretty easily, but for semantically connected topics, we might really have to have a very broad and sensitive search, including more potentially relevant results, and then spend more time in screening, or really rely on other methods that bring in relevant research like citation chasing to supplement the the search, because searching for topics that are not very well defined or not very frequently used can be really problematic. So I wanted to just run through some case studies. This was a topic looking at biomanipulation in Scandinavia to treat eutrophic lakes. And the idea is that you remove fish, and that allows plankton, algae, to be eaten by zooplankton. So you're manipulating a trophic scale to reduce eutrophication. And the objectives were to understand what studies had been conducted, but how it works, how long the effects last, and does the type of intervention and conditions in which it was applied alter the effectiveness. So the final question that was developed was, what's the influence of a reduction of planktivorous or benthivorous fish performed directly or indirectly through stocking of piscivores on water quality in temperate eutrophic lakes? And water quality was specifically measured as transparency or chlorophyll concentration. So there we've got a population of reduction of planktivorous and benthivorous fish. We're looking at all temperate eutrophic lakes, and the outcome is water quality. So it's a very long question that you would probably not put as your the title of your review in that way, perhaps, but it does provide almost sufficient specificity to allow it to be replicated. And this was a full systematic review. The next one was looking at the effects of agricultural management on soil organic carbon. And actually, it started off as a systematic review question that they wanted to know which interventions conserved soil organic carbon. And so the protocol was actually written as a systematic review, but we realized when we got some methodologists involved that actually what they were more interested in was understanding the nature of the evidence base, because it was so large, and we would do that first and then follow it up with targeted systematic reviews on specific interventions. So the question, which was a mapping one, was what evidence exists on the effects of agricultural management on soil organic carbon stocks in boreal temperate regions? So the intervention, agricultural management, soil organic carbon stocks is the outcome, and boreal temperate regions is the population there. And as I said, this was a map followed by reviews. This one is an example of a review that I think we did in 6 weeks. And this was part of the project where they got funding to do a review to look at eco-technologies. So not just evidence synthesis, but primary as well. And when the project started, they realized they didn't really have a framework of what counted as an eco-technology or not in a way that was really clearly system boundaried. So we wanted to identify how the evidence base had defined eco-technology and produce candidate definitions that we could then use to make our own and understand how those different definitions differed. So the research question was, how is the term eco-technology used in the research literature? And that just had a population of research literature and the phenomenon, which was reference to a definition of, or reference to a term, ecotechnology. And so this was a systematic map and then a thematic analysis to develop a framework, to develop a conceptual model. And then this example was looking at the impacts of mining in the Arctic. And it was a very contentious topic. We knew that evidence typically ignored indigenous knowledge. And we were particularly interested in comparing the evidence bases, the knowledge systems, to see how indigenous knowledge holders' knowledge differed from what had been predicted as the impacts from a business perspective and what had been studied from an effectiveness or impact research literature perspective. And we wanted to compare all of those together. So our question was, what are the social and ecological impacts of base metal mining in the Arctic? So our population in the Arctic, base metal mining was the intervention, and social and ecological impact was the outcome. But we were particularly interested in the types of outcomes that were the target of each of those 3 different knowledges. And so we had two systematic maps, one for EIAs and SIAs and one for research literature. and then a primary research study which aimed to map Indigenous knowledge in the same way. And so this is just another schematic to show how we can manage the workload to make sure our question maps onto something that's feasible by using what I refer to here as iterative reframing. So we might have our ideal scenario where we're looking at a regional population, a specific intervention, the presence absence as a comparator, a single outcome, but using different units, just experimental studies. And in this case, we might decide to focus on existing systematic reviews to clearly boundary our systematic review around a question that we know is going to be manageable. To show this in practice, what that might look like, if we had a review asking what the impacts of salmon farming are on social ecological systems, we might have different components of our question with the exposure, which is this first line, the species, which is the population, or actually sort of part of the intervention. So it also shows that the what you make into the population intervention can sort of, it's not a precise science. And then measures of social ecological systems, which gives us a very large combined set of search results, and we might deem that that's far too broad. So by making a small change just to focus on a single species, that second line drops down to 10%, and then specifically just looking at ecological systems might be a justifiable choice, which then gives us a much lower number. But also, if we add another system boundary in that we are just going to look at systematic reviews to do an umbrella review of existing literature reviews, we then get a much more manageable number of search results. And these searches were done in title, abstract, or full text in lens.org, just to highlight that these are a larger number of search results that you might get from a title, abstract keyword search in Web of Science, for example. But that was really a bit of a whistle-stop tour of question framing. We talked about what question framing is and why it's important. We've seen some types of systematically reviewable questions that involve full synthesis questions in systematic reviews and the sort of exploratory questions starting off. We talked about how to formulate a research question and implications of framing the question in a certain way based on certain system boundaries on the amount of work that we're going to end up with in terms of the search results. And we looked at how we can go about changing the boundaries for each of the components of our question in our conceptual model to ensure that what we've got is manageable. But yeah, that's it for me there.
Great, thanks so much, Neal. Let me myself here. That was just super helpful and informative. As a librarian, often we struggle with these research questions that are too broad and, sometimes are asked to rein in the search strategy by setting arbitrary publication date limits, that kind of thing. And of course, that's not ideal. So this has been really helpful and gives me a lot of good talking points and to go into those conversations with researchers. Definitely welcome questions from the audience, and looks like there's a few coming in, so let's go ahead and take some of these. Quick question from Olive Greeny. Do you use lens.org a lot?
Yeah, I do actually, primarily because I'm a freelancer and I don't have access to Web of Science or any other subscription platform. Lens.org has some intricacies in the way that it searches because it's a little bit restricted. It searches through the URL because it is completely web-based, but it is completely free and it almost completely approximates full Boolean searching of the type that you see in things like Scopus and Web of Science. The one thing I find really annoying is if you put a colon into your search, it just completely has a meltdown.
Yeah.
But beyond that, it's really what I love about it as well is it's replicable. So if you do a search, you can save the search URL, you can send it to a colleague, you can set updates, you can explore who the authors and stuff are. Like I do use it on a daily basis actually. So it is wonderful. And the fact that it's free is really, really brilliant.
Great, thanks. Next question from, let's see, so one up here from Julia. Am I correct that a huge difference between mapping reviews and systematic reviews is that mapping reviews do not look at outcomes at all? This seems like a helpful way to explain the difference as well.
So they do look at outcomes, but they shouldn't extract findings. Um, so sometimes you do see people extracting findings and then presenting them in a like positive, negative, green, red schematic, and that then is visual vote counting, which is why we don't want to see extracted findings, but we want to know what the outcomes were that had been measured in a map. So the big difference is it's what's the nature of the evidence base versus what does the evidence base say. I think that's the big difference.
Great, thanks. Kate asks, do stakeholders other than evidence synthesis authors have a role to play in getting authors to frame feasible questions? She's thinking of editors, funders, people who read and cite reviews.
That's interesting. I mean, I would say because I primarily work in policy relevant evidence synthesis, I'm not very commonly doing reviews for academic interests. So the evidence synthesis authors are probably the least relevant stakeholder in framing the question, really. They're the conduit for the people who need the evidence, need the knowledge. But that is because I work more in the sort of applied policy side of things, which I know isn't always the case, but also because I don't have research funding to answer questions I'm interested in, which is sad. And I would like it. But I think it's interesting about the feasibility of questions. I would like to see more editors and peer reviewers getting questions to be framed more feasibly. I think one of the problems is by the time the protocol's been written and submitted, if they are publishing a protocol, the question framing is kind of already a done deal. So once you see a finalized protocol, it's quite a late stage to be going back and saying, actually, I think you need to change your system boundaries. That does happen, and for sure, when I'm mentoring people, that is feedback that would be appropriate at the protocol peer review stage. But ideally, there should be a way for that feedback to come in earlier, kind of at the registration stage, if people are registering titles. But I can't think of a way of having that done on an institutional scale. But it would be nice to do like a pre-submission inquiry where they gave you feedback on your scope.
Hmm,
But,
great. Question from, let's see, losing track here. Andy, he asks, are you using any of the newish AI-powered search tools like Undermine, Elicit, etc.? Not for SR searching, obviously, but for more exploratory searches.
I don't. I don't get on very well with AI in general. Um, I think there are tools that really help with searching, but I think one of the problems of AI is it's not very good at like novel thought. And one of the things around framing a question is that you really need to have novel thought to think outside the box and reframe your question in a way that sort of makes sense. And so if you're thinking about framing and searching at the same time, so you're developing a search strategy and deciding what terms to include based on your framing, those are sort of hand in hand processes. And I think there are some tools that take away that important thinking step. So, for example, if you put in a set of search results and you use that provisional set of search results to suggest more terms to you, and there's a tool out there that does this, you put in a provisional set, it goes away, analyzes, and says, oh, you might want to include this in your search string. That's just confirming what you've already put in. What you want is for it to say, well, here's this semantically linked but terminologically distinct topic that you've missed.
Mm.
And AI is not very good at doing that because basically AI is an aggregative tool. It helps you find more of what you've already found. So it is very good at doubling up confirmation bias, which sometimes is useful if you want to do a systematic review where you're aggregating identical studies. Then like giving it more of the same helps it get better and better at what it's doing. If what you want it to do is go away and tell you something that you've missed, it's not going to do that. And I think the problem is some of these tools give that impression that they do. So that's my experience of AI, is that I prefer working with a blank sheet rather than, like, if you ask AI to do something for you and it gives you a document and it's like a bullet point list of suggestions, it's then really difficult to go back to scratch and think whether it's missed anything. You just go along with it. And so I think that's the big risk with AI for me. It takes away this like artistry in question formulation, which because I'm a photographer as well, I like that sort of the art of formulating a question and matching your searching and methods onto the actual objectives of the question. I think AI just removes you from that artistic process.
Mm. Great. Yeah, I think I've got everyone's questions. I just have one other one that I was wondering if you could address. I really love the way you frame the difference between evidence mapping, systematic maps, and systematic reviews. And I've used that framing quite a bit in my conversations with folks. Where do you sort of situate scoping reviews in that sort of world? And how do they differ from the two, I guess?
Yes, this really depends on the discipline. There's a really big disciplinary divide between in healthcare, where sometimes scoping reviews and systematic maps are synonymous, or scoping reviews are a spectrum from the rapid, what does the evidence look like in a short period of time, up to we're going to do a really good job. And then, like, we use systematic searching and really replicable methodology. And I've seen people do something that I would call a systematic review, but call it a scoping review. And then when it comes to doing a systematic review, they start from scratch. And that I think is a waste of resources when they've done such a good job. Because what you can do once you've done a systematic map is filter the studies that you're interested and just take them on to data extraction and critical appraisal. You don't need to search again if you've already looked at the whole evidence base. That so there's differences between disciplines, but in the field of environment, scoping reviews are a more rapid, corner cutting version of a systematic map, and they're very distinct things. Um, but that's not the same in every discipline. So I like to think of systematic maps as being identical in rigor and methodology to a systematic review, and then you can just filter and take onto a systematic review. And so we've done a systematic map that resulted in 4 systematic reviews, and those systematic reviews were able to be done in a very rapid amount of time. Actually, one of them took 8 years to do. That was because we sat on it and everybody changed jobs, but they could have been done very quickly after the systematic map. But one of the things that I find a bit frustrating is the doubling of effort across reviews and within a review, where, like, if you've done a really good mapping, then take that forwards. Don't go back to scratch and start from the beginning. And that's coming from my experience in areas where our evidence bases are messy and broad and generally much bigger than in healthcare. But we're all facing that problem now as the volume of evidence gets bigger and bigger.